Here we go. And Thomas, you will let me know if things aren't working.
This is all fine.
Intended.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Preaching prophetically in the digital limit situation is the topic for this paper, and I will have a similar approach to as Dr. Garner yesterday. I think of this paper more as a conversation starter. These conferences in the Gone Digital Network, I think they are brilliant in many ways, but one of the most important things to me is that they allow for vulnerability. All thoughts do not have to be finished and fiercely defended, which allows for creativity and collaboration. So see this as a conversation starter and hopefully some sort of intellectual collaboration. As said in the introduction, I finished up a thesis in practical theology, which built on 4 case studies on the practice of preaching in digital culture and spaces. And the results of this, of the cross-case analysis of these 4 cases, got me thinking about what a theology of preaching could look like that is based on these findings. Theology of preaching that would help preachers, or as we said in the last session, we call them micro-influencers. What would a theology of preaching look like that would help them to conceive of this practice of preaching in a fruitful way as we preach in digital culture and spaces? And I will walk you through my reasoning here and where I'm currently at in the process, and then I would like to invite you to the conversation. So here's the outline for what I will try to do here. I will talk shortly about the thesis results, about created co-creators as a possible framework, about prophetic preaching, and the move from co-creator to coexister. And if there is enough time in the end, I will reveal some of my theological building blocks in this process. Let's go. As I said, the thesis built on 4 different case studies. I basically used the German homiletician Wilfried Engelmann's way of conceptualizing the preaching event into phases. And then I made case studies of each of these phases. So the preparation phase, in particular, how the preachers theologize, and the verbalization phase, in particular, when and how religious digital creatives engage in the preaching event, and also the realization phase, in particular, the listening practices of the sermon listeners. And I'm not going to describe the cases. If anyone is interested, I can put a link to the thesis in the chat and you can look at that later. I used practice theoretical perspectives, mostly Theodor Schatzky, and they brought out how the practice of preaching involves not just humans and texts, but also material arrangements like digital media, but also other material arrangements. And that this feature, this collaboration often is amplified in digital culture and spaces. So in short, things like interaction, negotiation, cooperation, interdependency, and relational authority increased in the preaching in digital culture and spaces. Although there were, of course, instances of decrease as well. As we all know who study human interaction with digital media, there is always a both and. As, for example, discussed in the first paper session, there are potentials and problems for queer in digital spaces. But in my case studies of digital mediated preaching, I found that the increase was more significant than the decrease. So in light of this, I argued that the practice of preaching is characterized by co-preaching. And moreover, I argue that some of the implications of co-preaching are the enabling and encouragement of dialogue, imagination, and also lay preaching, but also an increased vulnerability for the co-preachers involved. That should not come as a surprise, since vulnerability is a necessary condition of interdependence and interaction. If there is more interaction and collaboration, there is bound to be more vulnerability as well. But coming from a field of homiletics that for so long has struggled to promote an understanding of dialogue and interaction and collaboration, the flip sides of this are rarely discussed. I found, and that is vulnerability. And I found that the preacher becomes more vulnerable in relation to other humans, but also in relation to the material arrangements, in particular of digital media. A digital mediated preaching event is dependent on the media involved. We know that. And it is often invisible to users until it stops working or starts working in unexpected and unforeseen ways. Most of the preachers and also co-preachers of the humankind that I interviewed in the case studies were very unhappily aware of digital media and how it often resists perfect functionality. The skips, the stutter, the buffering, the perpetual loading, the disconnect. Well, we also experienced it during this conference. In particular, the listeners were vulnerable in relation to the co-preacher of digital media. Could be people who do not know how to operate it or people who cannot afford it. And as many of us has pointed out during this conference, the already vulnerable often becomes more vulnerable. And the preacher were also more vulnerable in relation to other humans. They experienced the same things as Sabrina Müller spoke of in the first paper session, for example, hate and threats. And the significance of this for the practice of preaching is evident in the quote from one of the preachers. She said, "For a pastor who is supposed to be open, understanding, and attentive, it clashes with your pastoral identity. To survive, you need to steel yourself and develop a thick skin. At the same time, your pastoral duty is to constantly practice attentiveness and empathy. These things clash." Other co-preachers involved in the preaching event also became more vulnerable in relation to other humans. In the collaboration surrounding the sermon, there were rarely symmetrical power relations. The deliberation, the negotiations did not take place among equals. And these negotiations, for example, between pastors and technicians, might not be as respectful and empathetic as the ones I was fortunate to observe. And furthermore, this is important for our topic of the conference, the increased vulnerability put the preacher in a situation where the content of the sermon was affected. For example, a preacher dependent on relational and negotiated authority might be tempted to shun away from challenging topics because preaching uncomfortable truths could negatively impact relationships and therefore her authority. And further on, followers and number of likes. In the case studies, many preachers testified to this fact, that they chose topics and themes that were not too controversial or complicated, and they did this to fit the format of the digital media co-preacher. And they also said that since we are preaching in a more public situation, they tried not to be too contextual and too specific, and they tried to come across as welcoming and not say something that could upset people and make them not want to come to back to the local church when it opened again, and that they weighed their words and avoided saying certain things. It could also be said to, of course, have a positive effect, because some listeners reported that they thought the preacher preached so much better now when the sermon became public, since the preachers prepared more. But I think that the problems are also obvious here. And we also saw in another project that interviewed preachers that the digital format could also lead to complete silence. A few preachers mentioned that when during the transition to online worship, they chose not to preach at all due to the risk of online hatred. And these were women pastors in a very conservative diocese who were often critiqued in the on-site setting, and they could not bear the load of hatred in the more public online setting. So in other words, the vulnerability associated with co-preaching could, in worst case scenarios, lead to silence. So, having written up this thesis, I started to think about what a theology of preaching based on the findings could look like. There are a few brilliant suggestions out there. Cases Sigmund Thornberg's work with process theology, some Young's work with Karl Barth's theology, but there's definitely room for more. So I thought I should give it a go. And of course, I went straight like a moth to the flame to Philip Hefner and the co-created theological framework. As Melanie so brilliantly pointed out already, it is very commonly used. And in my own Swedish Lutheran tradition, it's also particularly beloved, not least since the Archbishop of Lutheran Church of Sweden is part of that science theology conversation that Melanie described and regularly wrote for Zygon journal. So it could be a perfect wrap, right? Co-preaching, and then could be seen as creative co-creators who through their interaction and collaboration in the preaching event participate in the creating work of God. It's perfect. But what to do with the vulnerability? It is there in an undercurrent in the world created. Since we are a created creature, we're not perfect and commit sin. But however, it is again, just like the dialogue and conversation approaches to homiletic and emphasis on the positive side, on the creativity and the fragility in human nature kind of slips into the background. Furthermore, as Ellen Graham points out in a discussion about this concept, the creator co-creator, she says that it does have its advantages, but it comes with inherent risks. And one risk is that creativity may become a theological sanction for unlimited mastery over and against the other, both human and non-human others. And if you invite the homiletical strand called prophetic preaching into the conversation, the disappearing vulnerability stands out even more as a problem. Prophetic preaching. As Leonore Tops-Tisdale has pointed out, there are quite a lot of definitions of prophetic preaching out there, so I would like to say a few words on that. And I also think that this could be relevant to our discussions today. In my thinking here, I draw mainly from Leonore Tops-Tisdale and the homiletician that already have been mentioned many times here, or Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann. Theology, and they say that prophetic preaching is theology for a specific context in a specific time, and that the message of the Bible is different from many of the narratives in contemporary society. And because of that, the task of the preacher is to help listeners to see that and then act upon it. Brueggemann says, what the prophetic tradition knows is that it could be different, and the difference can be enacted. Brueggemann emphasizes the role of the Bible texts in this endeavor, and Tops-Tisdale the role of prayer, that you gain a prophetic point of view through remaining in connection to God and the people of God. And as we heard in the previous session, there is also these important words that Brueggemann used. Prophetic preaching is about criticizing and energizing. Criticizing is, of course, not about accusing, but giving voice to pain, suffering, and injustice. And energizing is about giving a hopeful vision of what might be, to call the listener into action and transformation. And I imagine that Brueggemann and Tops-Tisdale would have a few things to say about the results of the thesis. I think that they would rejoice that the energizing part of the preaching task seems not to be a problem. On the contrary, I would agree with the brilliant work of Ilona Nord, who already 10 years ago wrote that experience of digital spaces or virtuality might even encourage preachers and listeners to do this imagining God's possibilities. However, they might not be as impressed by the criticizing part of the preaching task, because it seems to be even more difficult in digital mediated preaching due to the preacher's increased vulnerability. And I think that a theology of preaching that draws upon the co-creative framework could further add to this imbalance between criticizing and energizing. So where to go then? I'm just going to close the door so you don't have to listen to my family swimming in the pool. I found an interesting option in Amanda Lagerkvist's recent book, Existential Media, a media theory of the limit situation. Lagerkvist points to the fact that in her field of media theory, discussions tend to focus on the limitlessness of media, a limitlessness that is often associated with creativity and endless possibilities. There are, however, drawbacks to that approach, not least that it tends to gloss over that both technology, the people using it, and the resources that are used to produce the technology are limited. In addition, it tends to marginalize, she says, people who already are at the limits even further, making them invisible. And in order to invigorate the discussion, Lagerkvist wants to turn the tables and rethink media from the site of limits. She positions herself within new materialism, that being is entangled with technology or media. And people in this position usually don't Heidegger, but Lagerkvist instead draws on one of Heidegger's philosopher colleagues, Karl Jaspers, instead. And through her reading of Jaspers, Lagerkvist identifies something that seems like a paradox. The deep relationality is connected not just to change and possibilities and creativity, but also to vulnerability, loss of control, limitation, obscured communication, and silence. In fact, creativity is often sparked by limitation and vulnerability. They need each other. At the same time as media are the infrastructures of being that ground us in materiality, in existence, they also, says Lagerkvist, throw us up in the air. Media is essentially delimited, and their limitation makes us aware of our human delimitations. In other words, they remind us that we are interdependent, vulnerable creatures that come into being only through others. The originary technicity of human existence is thus intimately connected to originary vulnerability and deep relationality of human existence. And this is why she would rather speak of the human subject as coexister instead of, well, the usual subjects in media studies: audience, media citizens, consumers, entrepreneurial selves, savvy users, early adopters, individuals, or in our example here, created co-creators. The coexister is not the rational, independent, disembodied, autonomous measure of all things person of old school humanism that often surfaces in media theory discussions. The coexister is instead a co-inhabitant who can only be realized through other beings, and others, to Lagerkvist as well as Jaspers, is any entity. It's mineral, plants, animal, humans, or God. The coexister is a deeply relational being, she writes, who is stumbling and hurting, responsive and responsible, imbricated in socio-technological ensembles, and traversing these terrains more or less successfully in search of, while never fully achieving, what might cautiously be termed existential security. She is also, and this is very important to Lagerkvist, an ethically responsible being. And this is an essential part of Lagerkvist's thinking about the coexister. The experience of vulnerability is also a call from the universe to ethical responsibility and action. Yes, Scandinavians, you hear Lögstrup here, of course. Thus, Lagerkvist proposes that in our reflection on digital media, and perhaps in our reflection on preaching in digital culture and spaces, we could do well to take the coexister and the experience of the digital limit situation as starting points. I think it could resonate very well with prophetic preaching and the idea that the energizing task of preaching is intimately connected to the criticizing part. And it could also do justice to the experiences of vulnerability, so frequently mentioned and observed in my case studies. I think I'm about to run out of time, so I'm just going to give you the framework, the question that I hope we can discuss afterwards. building blocks. I've tried to work with some resources, and I've used as a framework to kind of what components do I need, what kind of Lego parts would I need to build theology preaching. I've used Wilfred Engelman there as well, and he thinks that theology of preaching could have 4 components. It needs some theology about God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, what they are doing. And I found it very productive during the prayer today. So thank you, Thomas, for asking us, could it be the Holy Spirit that enables you to engage with digital theology? I got some good thinking done there. And also, one component is theological anthropology. You also need eschatology as part of your theology of preaching and ecclesiology. And if there's due time, I could give you the Lego blocks that I started working with later on.